Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and I'm back with one of our 5-minute Histories videos. In fact, I'm back from a video vacation of a week, where my colleague Molly and I were able to get some badly needed work done that had been piling up over the last 4 months. So thank you everybody. If you're a regular viewer, thank you for giving us a little bit of a break here to get our other work done. And I'm here today. My film crew is my 16-year-old son Johns. My daughter Leah, who had been the film crew, got a job as a lifeguard, so Johns is stepping in. Thank you, Johns. All right, today we're going to talk about Tyson Street. I'm here in Mount Vernon on the 900 block of Tyson Street, which I think has a legitimate claim to being the most charming block in Baltimore. And it almost wasn't. It was almost a highway. So today's video we're going to talk about both Tyson Street as a fight against the highway and as one of the earliest, maybe the earliest examples of revitalization with artists. Artists moving in to revitalize a block. So Tyson Street got its start in the years before the Civil War. That's when it was built. And if you look at a map today, it goes all the way from Mount Vernon to downtown. Today it sort of starts and stops along the way, but originally it was a contiguous street. And it's named for Elijah Tyson, the great 1700s, early 1800s Baltimorean who worked his entire life. He was a merchant, but worked his entire life on behalf of ending slavery and both freeing enslaved people, but also trying to prohibit free African Americans from being sold into slavery. So that's where the street gets its name. It was when it was first built, the houses were occupied largely by immigrants and largely by Irish immigrants, Irish workmen, carpenters, rug makers. I think we've got some documentation for. By the 1900s, and particularly by the 1920s and 30s, Tyson Street, including this block, was occupied largely by African American Baltimoreans. And in the 1940s, that made it a target. It was old houses occupied by African Americans, and that made it a target for what was called slum clearance of the day. But in the 1940s, Tyson Street becomes a hub for artists. First, in the early 1940s, a gentleman named Eddie Rosenthal moves in. He's a painter, and this was really unusual because he chose to move from a quote-unquote more affluent neighborhood into a less affluent neighborhood, take on a house that needed a lot of repairs and fix it up. And this was something that really wasn't being done in the day, and he was a groundbreaker in that. He was also a wacky bohemian. His living room, this is how wacky he was. His living room, instead of having a coffee table, it had a butcher block, and on top of it, it had like a little miniature rocking horse as a decoration. That was really, really out there. After Eddie moves in, a whole bunch of other artists start moving in, and they attract the attention of the Baltimore Evening Sun. And let me read you a quote from 1947 in the Baltimore Evening Sun. The author says of Tyson Street, one block is full of garages and storehouses. One block is still full of straggly cats and old settlers. But the surrealistic third block, that's this block, is full of trick door knockers, sleek cats, and new settlers who have interspersed the standard red house fronts with giddy color patterns combining mustard yellow, bottle green, and eggplant purple. In this block live antique dealers, artists, a museum director, two department store display artists, a photographer, a cellist, an art teacher, and a few representatives of business. So that's who was on this one small block. The Evening Sun author, however, was not very happy with what was going on. She was fearful that the artists, who were all white, were displacing the prior residents who were predominantly African American. And she writes, she feels that this was really a betrayal to Elijah Tyson's legacy, Tyson who fought so hard for the rights of African Americans. The residents of Tyson Street, however, were fought back against the Evening Sun, and here is what one of them, they said that they in fact did not displace African Americans, that the African Americans that did move found better housing, and that they were contributing to the revitalization of the city. One of the residents, in fact, writes, before tearing down any more of Baltimore's old houses, think twice. Think about restoration instead of destruction. There's room in Baltimore for many more Tyson Streets. And in fact, Tyson Street becomes a model for private investment revitalizing cities. None other than the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1950 cites Baltimore's Tyson Street as an example of private urban renewal. Those were their words. And the dispute between the artists revitalizing the block and those fearful of displacement was never really resolved, because in the 1950s, perhaps a bigger threat came along, and that was a highway. Beginning in the 1940s, Baltimore City had been planning highways, no fewer than 8 different designs through Fells Point, the East-West Expressway, which is now called the Highway to Nowhere, that was built, and a number of plans through Mount Vernon. These were all more or less academic because the city and state didn't have the money to build them. But in 1956, the federal government passed the Federal Highway Aid Act, and that provided money to cities and to states, including Baltimore and Maryland, to take their highway dreams and turn them into reality. And here through Tyson Street, the 900 block, was proposed an inner circle, a belt that would allow drivers to go from the Jones Falls Expressway and skirt around downtown to get onto Interstate 70. And it went right through the middle of where I'm standing today. The folks on Tyson Street fought back. One resident recalls being on vacation in 1956, and a neighbor calls up and says, "You better get back now. They're planning the highway through your kitchen." And in fact, they were. They formed the Save Tyson Street Committee, wrote to Mayor D'Alessandro trying to plead with him to save their block. D'Alessandro turned a deaf ear. He was a staunch highway proponent. The head of the city's Department of Public Works writes back and says, if it is a choice of value between Tyson Street and the highway has much more value. Sorry, folks. And that dispute continues. The highway planners they felt that the highways were this perfect solution. It was sort of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. They could clear out, quote unquote, slums, decrepit housing that was not bringing much property tax revenue back to the city. And they could have this sleek new way for suburbanites to work and to shop downtown, bringing, they felt, revenue back to downtowns. The committee, the Tyson Street Committee, was in a little bit different of a shape, because here we had, on the other hand, the city planners were touting the private investment that had revitalized Tyson Street. Indeed, all over the country, Tyson Street was held up as an example. And so it was not an easy case. In fact, we're standing here today, and it is not a highway. Tyson Street was spared. In fact, the inner circle was abandoned entirely. The folks in West Baltimore that were displaced because of the Highway to Nowhere, the East-West Expressway, were not as lucky. But today, Tyson Street remains this charming, charming place. And I'd encourage you, if you want a lovely stroll, come on down and take a walk on the 900 block of Tyson Street. Thanks so much. I'm sorry, one more thing. There was a wonderful article on Tyson Street by a researcher named Emily Lieb. And we'll put a link up here if you want to read a little bit more about what's been going on here. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.